Welcome to the World Builder's Anvil, episode 213. Today's topic, World Builder's Guide to Fantasy Map Making. Woohoo! Don't know where to start building your fantasy world?
Do you need more? Does it make sense?
Forget any worries and become a crafter of imagination.
This is the place where we will prime your mind.
Now, it's time to heat up the forge.
Break out the mithril ingots and hammer.
Welcome to the World Builder's Anvil. I'm Jeffrey W. Ingram.
And I'm Michael Miller.
Let's sup from the muck of Java and build. Welcome back. As always, my name is Jeffrey W. Ingram.
And new and improved, wow. I am Michael Miller.
New and improved, is there like an actual reason for that, or are you just making that up?
Well, there's multiple reasons. The one big one is that last week it finally, the straw that broke the camel's back finally hit last week, and Sarah's like, just go get the oral surgery done. So I went and I had the oral surgery that I needed done.
Oh, for the tooth?
So my jaw and my tooth and just feels a lot
So you were
better.
lacking certain pain that you've had the last couple times we've recorded.
Yeah. So I'm feeling a lot better now. And also, the working out and everything is going well.
I feel better from you doing that too. I mean, it's
just
been
killing
really effective.
So I'm expecting to be all kinds of bikini summer by like June, July. And
for those of you who don't know Michael but want to, he's not lying. He actually only wears bikinis to the beach.
Yeah, I mean the ones that'll still let me there. You know.
Yeah,
I've been banned from a great many of the eastern seaboard, but still trying.
We still have 4 more beaches to go.
I know. But they've got pictures of me. Lucky them.
All right. And so we get so that we've done a couple episodes of maps before. I think Mike and I have only actually done one. All these freaking maps. And then I did one a long time ago, but I've never really gone through sort of how to make maps. And so this is actually going to be a series. And this is sort of all of the stuff I kind of think about whenever I make a map. And then I'm going to do individual episodes that actually make certain types of maps, because you make different maps for different reasons. So
we actually had some discussion about maps in the
we've talked about geography and
Facebook
stuff like
group.
Oh yeah.
Well, I know, but what I'm saying in the Facebook group. So if you guys want to go check that out, go to facebook.com/groups/Undercroft. Yes. Mm-hmm. So the Fantasy World Builders Undercroft. Come join us on Facebook, and we'll talk about maps along with tons of other things.
Yeah, there's actually a couple of cartographers in the group, as well as the people who are more amateur. Like I consider myself an amateur cartographer. I've actually been paid to make real life maps before, so I do have.
I didn't know that.
Oh yeah. But not actual like real world stuff. Not actual. I've not been commissioned to do fake stuff.
I have to draw building maps a lot, so not like lands, but specific buildings for electrical needs and
which actually leads very tightly into the first part. What type of map do you need? And I had a few listed here, and Michael just listed another very valid version of building maps. Sometimes you need maps. Maps are for all kinds of occasions. The 4 big ones I thought about for fantasy world building is star charts. Obviously, that's fantasy, Star Wars. Overland, city, and dungeon maps.
Now, what would you call an overland map? Are you talking about just like the continent? Are you talking?
It could be a continent or a portion of the continent. It's something where you typically just use symbols to represent like cities or maybe castles, larger types of structures rather than an individual structure, which that's why I call a city map. Even though it might not technically be a city, it could be like a village in some countryside, but that's zoomed in a lot so you can see sort of individual structures within it. Star charts, there are a couple different kinds of star charts. You have one of a solar system itself, which some people might not actually call a star chart, but I would call a chart of a star. Or a bigger star chart, which is like multiple systems, and there are many different ways to do maps. Actually, one of the favorites I ever made was actually for my fantasy world. It was the my dwarfs broken down into two groups: the inner dwarfs, which live on the surface of the planet, and the outer dwarfs, which live inside of the planet, because they think space is made up of stone. And so, if you want to find heaven, you have to dig to it. So they dig massive tunnels and they build cities that they occupy for a while. Then they leave as they've create the next city.
I really like that mentality of your dwarves, because it's such a it's almost just like an opposite, because they talk about building a ladder to heaven, and they're like, no, the dwarves are like, no, you guys have it just the opposite. You got to dig. You got to go down, not up.
This thing that we're in is just a big cave. It's just a big cave. And that's their thought, is the surface of the planet is just a cave, a really big one. And
I wonder how they would feel about the cave allegory, the shadows on the wall, the Plato's
they think Plato's outlook. An idiot.
Yeah. Well, he's talking about caves, though. But
only for you weaklings that need light.
So the big thing is here, as we devolve, is what kind of map do you need? Mm-hmm. But when you start getting into like star charts, it always makes me think of knowing what you're building and how much science you want to put into it. Because if you say, okay, well, I'm going to build a star chart, if you're building a framework, realistic style world, then you really need to do a lot of reading. If you're just making a fantasy world, you can just plot out the planets and the stars and say that's how it is, and it works because I say so.
Yeah,
which is kind of the camp I fall into, but at the same time, I love science, so I like to know a bit. But I definitely don't always fall back.
I know more than I share
rules.
sometimes, and that's one of them. It's like I do know the distance between all of the orbits and the solar system Gardule's in. Mm-hmm. How many moons are around there. But like, especially like the charts I use for solar systems sort of break it down into inner solar system and outer solar system, and it doesn't really try and show the distance, because if you did that, you would you'd have a bunch of tiny things in a vast sea of black.
Well, see, when I say I know things, I basically I want to know a little bit about the real world science, but then I choose to ignore the stuff that's not convenient to what I'm building.
You can do that too. Yeah, that's perfectly fine. And the thing is, as we've started to find planets, we found that there are a lot more exceptions to what especially like when me and Michael were in school thousands of years ago for the younger people. They thought that there was a very rigid way you could build a solar system, and they found that there's a lot of really wild things going on out there that they had no clue about. Like Jupiter's right up close to the sun, and they call them hot Jupiters because they're literally on fire on the inside because they're so close. And they always thought that those kind of planets would have to be further out in the system for it to make sense. So, take everything with a grain of salt. I like to... my habitable systems are typically follow a pattern much like Earth's, but they don't need to. And the thing is, you don't always have to explain, especially if you're not taking a hard science approach to something. You don't necessarily need to explain all of that to the readers, and they might not even understand why the suns are having the impact they do on the planet. Just because you're talking about from the observation of the people, not from the observation of the suns. So.
And part of even that first question of what type of map do you need actually leads right into your second one. They kind of really go hand in hand there, which is what is the purpose for your map?
The reason I break this down to a separate question is, one, is this map for you, or is it to package to give away with something? And both are great reasons to make maps. But for Jeffrey, when, as a game master or as a world builder who creates fiction, I know a lot more than what other people know. You are not going to know everything about my world from looking at my map. You're going to know major things. Now, if it's for a player, and it might also be a little bit more stylized and a bit more artistic if it's not for me. For me, it's strictly a utilitarian thing that I want to know where my things are. I want to be able to tell the distance between areas. I want to see the overall flow of the geography.
Let me ask you a quick question about a dungeon layout. Get a GM's perspective on this. Like, say for sake of argument, you could lay out a dungeon, spend all this time creating a map, and have ideas for different rooms and chambers and what have you, but then the players decide to go down in a way and you know, you don't want to ham-fisted kind of usher them back to the way where you really want them to go. How do you feel about the concept of not having a map that is rigid, but having a storyline so that you know when they get into the second chamber, regardless of whether they turn left or right, the second chamber is where X event occurs. And then if they go back to this way, regardless, this is going to occur. So while you have a concept of what's going to occur where, the map is more fluid. You could actually draw it as you go. Like, is that... I realize, because you lean more architect. So,
well, I like map making, so I usually have an idea of layouts before I do. Most of the underground types of stuff I do are not epic in scale. They're more smaller and intimate, and there are some ways that are just going to be dead ends. That's just the nature of things. There's an approach I took when I was. This was years and years ago, maybe even before I knew you. And I think I got this from...
thousands, a couple thousand years ago.
Millions of years ago, maybe. Pre-dynastic Egypt. And I was in the city of Highwall, which has become Klein Forest. It is a massive city at the time, like millions of people. And old cities like that typically have very confusing and chaotic layouts. And I got this idea from... a module called Waterdeep, I believe, which was another massive city set in an old setting, which was the major roads were all laid out and you knew like what was on the major roads, but like on the internals, they had blocks. And then depending on what quarter of the town you were in, you'd randomly generate the blocks as you went through if you try to go the back way, it was like randomly generated because it was so hard to keep track of where you were. Which I thought was kind of a neat way to do it, where entire sections were blank on the map and would be randomly generated as you went into them. So it would be good for keeping up that feeling of lost in the big city. My only problem with that sort of a scenario is if they're from the area, they should know what's where.
Yeah, that's true.
But it's an interesting idea, and I have no issue. I've done that before in games too, where I've had a big map laid out on a table, and I've actually drawn out and edited sort of things going into it as they're going in. I use random encounters a lot in those style of dungeons, or if it's a really large dungeon, it's like I'll have certain things in certain areas, but then I'll have random things that I can just chuck into rooms, and I might modify it slightly in my brain, like I wouldn't have like. Two beasts that hate each other, chamber apart. But so some things maybe are modified roles in my brain, and I'll just kind of skim close to it to find something a little bit more appropriate. But I have no issues doing that in maps. I think, especially if it's like this journey of exploration style of dungeon, where you're delving into this deep dungeon. I think randomly doing stuff or doing it on the fly and saying every so often I want to add in something of importance. But I think if you make it too easy that way, it's linear with sort of randomized parts in there. So you have to, sometimes, people go the wrong direction. Sometimes you hit dead ends. And that's the great lesson of dungeons. It is a true life lesson, which is you can choose the wrong way.
I know I kind of pushed you off a tangent cliff there with that question, but we were talking about...
Welcome to the Worldbuilder's Anvil.
Yeah, your purpose for the map.
Yeah, so it's knowing, is it for you? And I've done this too, where I've had maps for players and maps for GMs.
And the map for the player is totally incomplete and probably full of lies.
Full of lies and omitting very important things like the military checkpoints and that sort of thing.
This is the safe spot. On my map, the safe spot looks really big, but it seems like we're getting in a lot of trouble everywhere we go in that, safe spot.
Yeah. Then a few other things I like to think about whenever I make maps. And once again, this is all before I get started. I kind of have an idea of the type of map I want to do. I have the idea of the purpose of the map. Is it for me? Is it for someone else? And then is this idea of who's the map, or what is the map for? So is the map meant to explain the world? So it's more of a metaphysical sort of like is it more of a culture's way of trying to explain where they are fits into their belief structure? You know, because they might have, like, the mountain of the gods might be up in this sort of grayed out area.
So in this scenario, you would be talking about a map within the world that culture has or is aware of. So
exactly.
They're like, well, this local mountain or this local geography, we call it X thing because of our belief in whatever.
Well, not only that, though, it might not be the exacting nature of the cartography isn't as important. It's more of important. It's sort of like all of the old Middle Age maps where Jerusalem was always at the center of the map, because Jerusalem was the center of the universe. So no matter the frame of the map, if Jerusalem was in it, it would be the center of the map, even though it wouldn't necessarily make sense for I'm showing off my my kingdom of Denmark, in the scope of the world. I'm off in the corner, but the thing is, I'm showing our place in the world. Did you
ever see the movie How to Train Your Dragon #2?
No, I've not seen any of the How to Train Your Dragon movies.
Great movies, first of all. But in the second one, kind of like what you're talking about, Jerusalem being in the center. Of course, if you have a map as the character in a world, you're probably centered on where you live, and the map probably doesn't go super far. Well, this character does a lot of exploring, so at one point he breaks out a map and he unfolds it, and he has added to it. So he unfolds what is clearly the original map, and then he unfolds an additional page that he has attached, and then a secondary page, and then he unfolds this corner, and it expands outward because these are all the areas that he's explored. So he's basically creating this larger exploratory map that no one else has done before. Which
the interesting thing is, I know, like,
I thought it was a great detail. I thought it was a great detail that you don't normally see in that kind of fiction.
Well, I think it's interesting too, because I know, like, in fantasy, speaking of people who've been on the show before, Deanne Frost, sort of, I think her lead or a very important character in her novels is a cartographer. And so he's mapping out these things, so you get new maps revealed as the stories go deeper, which is, I think, a very neat way of doing it. But like I said, when I talk about explaining the world, it's to explain why we're here kind of maps. And the geography themselves are part of that. But, it's like the land of the horses are this way, the land of the trolls are that way. It's not meant to really do what the second type of map does, which is describe the world. Most of the maps that we use in today's world, especially for getting around, are about describing the world, where the mountains are, where the roads are in relationship to the mountains, how things relate to each other from a physical geography standpoint. But that's explain the world sometimes has some of those elements mixed into it, but it's more a way of explaining why we are where we're at, in the world. A show of power map, might be one to try and show the expanse and the importance of your lands compared to the others.
The other thing's great, especially with like a show of power, is something that you can create like timeline maps, and it is such a useful tool as a storyteller. It immediately reminds me of Batman No Man's Land, where every month or week, however many issues they ran in that series, there was a map at the beginning of the issue, because the city would keep getting it was territorial, so there would be different gang territories every time a new issue came out based on the events that occurred in the prior. The map changed. It was like, oh, well, the Penguin has taken over these 30 blocks, and he took it away from Killer Croc's area, and Clayface has been pushed over, and depending on what occurred in it, they would restructure a map, and it kind of, that's an insight to how warring factions and conquering, kingdoms change things over time. It's obviously in the microcosm of Gotham, but it gives you an idea how world maps changed and territories changed as different power structures come to be.
Or as a show of power too, think about this. I'm the Emperor of China. What was for a long time, and maybe even still considered today, the Middle Kingdom. And the point being, from their perspective, much like we said Jerusalem was the center of the world, they thought China was the center of the world. And if you looked at their maps at the time, because of the way the geography goes, you have the really harsh mountains and harsh jungles that block off southern China and western China from the world. You have, Korea and Vietnam and Japan, kind of these small little enclaves of other civilizations. You have sort of a sea of nomads north of you in the plains. But, so you send as, a gift to the king of Korea, a map of the world showing gigantic China and little Korea next to it.
Not to scale, not to scale.
And there are
China
possible
is much bigger.
There are possible other reasons for maps as well too. I'll include some more in the show notes that I was getting from the Undercroft group Michael was talking about earlier today. We were chatting about this a little bit. Now, once I have down, what type of map it is, what the purpose of the map is, what the map is for, then I want to know what the purpose of the map maker is. And there are sometimes a very utilitarian thing, like I need to know the coastlines. Like if you look at ancient maps of the Mediterranean, they have oftentimes very, very detailed coastlines, but the interiors of the land get very vague. And that's because they had a hard time actually doing exacting mapping inland, because you don't have, the harsh contrast with the ocean to be able to map it out. So it was a lot harder to do that kind of mapping. So the coastlines would develop really intricately first, and then over time, the interiors would start to get more and more filled out. So something like that for a trader would be a very important tool, knowing where the good places to set your boats down overnight. If you're in an ancient culture, you need to know where I can set my boats down at night, so beach them and not get killed. But that way I can do trading at a long distance, over the sea. Also too, is the map maker trying to understand the land and why? Does the map maker, is he like a spy who's been sent in to make a map to give to an enemy king or nation who plans to invade? There are lots of different reasons on why maps are made. And oftentimes these detailed description of the world maps, might often be illegal in a world or in a civilization.
I'm sorry, might often be a what?
Illegal.
Illegal?
Yeah, showing where the mountain passes are, detailed descriptions of how to navigate through cities. Part of the defensive structure, in a world before the age of information, is to hide all that kind of stuff to make it more difficult on your enemies when they do invade.
Yeah, correct me if I'm wrong. Kleinfar is designed that way.
Yes. Most of my coastal cities are designed that way. The Bedrachim culture in general grew up as a warrior culture. So tribally, there was a lot of raiding that would go back and forth. So as their cities came up, they very confusing. We talked about this in the game with Marky Mark. Marcus Mark.
Marcus.
Where, it's like you walk in, if you follow what looks like the main road, you come to a dead end. And then you realize you have to go back to one of the turns to get to actually other parts of the city. It's just a designed kill zone for if someone would come to invade or raid the city.
So, more on the map maker, please.
Mm-hmm. So really, you're just trying to define what is the reasoning of the person making the map, and not if it's a utilitarian map for you, it's not so important. But especially for maps that you give away, it helps tell the story a little bit by sharing the map, and knowing, almost have a character who makes the map, even if they're not involved in the story, with a purpose to doing it. It's a way to help share parts of your story very discreetly. And for someone like me, I eat that kind of stuff up.
It creates a whole second layer, because it's one thing to, like at the beginning of the book, have a map that your readers are going to assume is perfectly accurate because within the context of the story, you may not have a character go, let's look at the map, and they pull out a map, and obviously early maps are not perfectly to scale or perfectly represent everything and blah, 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 blah. But if that is never part of the tale and you aren't coming from the map maker perspective, then they assume that what they're looking at is 100% accurate, and it's just a stylized map of your world, thus giving a transparency to the existence of different locations. But if you include that layer of this was made by a character within my world, then it throws a lot of that out the window. There could be entire big land masses that aren't there because they just haven't found them yet. They haven't gotten there yet.
Yep. Or the distance to things are presumed, and maybe it's very good in the local area, but as you get further away, those distances might be really far off. But the thing is, it's very tough to make maps that way, especially if you do them. And so don't get super concerned with that unless you need it for your storytelling, unless you want your world building to have that feel. I mean, my maps, when they get released, are all pretty much to scale, but it's definitely something that you can play around with and add a perspective. It makes it very difficult in a map curating sense if you do a lot of stuff from one world.
Well, I think it also lends you a convenient tool, because if you decide to change something or you decide that based on a plot line, a certain piece of land has to be a little more to the west or a little further away or whatever, you can say, well, it's always been that way. It's just, the map makers weren't accurate in the first book. So you could just put out a second map of your world, and you could add stuff that was not there.
Yeah, or maybe it's
change things that were. I mean, take a look at old world maps of Earth.
Well, speaking of that, the next thing is study some real maps over the ages.
I didn't even realize that was the next one.
It's just you're so intuitively good at this. You don't need the show.
Well, on the flip side of it, you laid out really good show notes for it. So the conversation lent itself right into the notes.
Yeah, and so I want to put a link into an article from The Guardian, which just has a whole bunch of different maps over the ages. I love maps over the ages. They're so intricate. The whole idea of dragons be there, or be here, I believe. The monsters on the side of the maps in the water. The compass roses. Maps are really interesting, and it's interesting you get a little bit of the idea of the people of the age and what they think based off of, if you see a map of the universe from the Middle Ages, once again, Jerusalem will be at the center, and then you have this layer where the sun is, and it just sort of circularly goes out. But, it's not meant to necessarily be, it wasn't even meant to be scientifically accurate. It was meant to describe, once again, or explain the place of things in the universe. Once again, definitely go check out some real world maps. We have a link to a whole bunch in that article if you go to the show notes at garduel.com for episode 213. There's a link in the description. You might have to cut and paste it depending on what kind of browser you're in or where you get your information from. Now, the last thing I like to think about, and I'm very particular when I do this, is I have a specific order of creation. I'm not going to go to all of them now because it varies map to map how I map things out. But one of the big things to consider, and this is mainly for overland maps, but it kind of works in theory if you think about it in the same way. I go from the highest to the coastline. The coastline is the first thing I define on a map because that's sort of where everything comes together in a world. You have the sea on one side, you have land on the other side. So I need to know where the coastline is. Then I start from the highest point and I work down to the coastline. And then if the in-water stuff's important, I go to the lowest point and work up to the coastline.
Highest, you're referring to sea level height, right?
Yes, height over sea.
Okay.
And
as opposed to visually looking at the map, the northernmost point, the highest.
Yep. And then I'll go to the lowest point underwater if that's important for the map, which is usually not for me. And I work up to the coastline as well too. So it's the lowest elevation up. So I'm always kind of working towards the coastline depending on if I'm underwater or over water. That way I want to make sure that all of the elements of the map are visible and they look good in the final product. And it just kind of works better. And when we go into the overland map creation, the next episode, we'll go into that and I'll kind of explain a little bit more detail of why I choose what things in what order. So, and the other thing is too, to make it a map, maps, especially the ones that you give away, need to have titles. They should have a scale bar if they're meant to describe the world, and compass roses are very important. How do people navigate with it? They need something to point in whatever is important direction. Whether it be north. For Bedraken maps, actually the ones, and I'll share some in the show notes here I've had made for me, where I've actually shifted the compass rose east, because east is their primary direction, the way they navigate. It's a pre-compass culture. They have nothing to point them to true north. So to them, east is a very spiritual direction. So at that point, east is the most important direction. Ergo, the compass roses point east. I did that to make it simpler myself. Instead of shifting the orientation of everything on the map, I just declared that the compass rose gets turned. That way I can make it the same way I make them, but have the compass rose point in the direction important to them. But yeah, so once again, this is to get you started with some information that will help you out in your journey. But, once again, just think about whenever you want to create a map is what kind of map do you need? It's not always the same style of map. What is the purpose for the map? What is the map for, and what was the purpose of the map maker? Those things will allow you to make really good, compelling maps that actually, can enhance storytelling and help you keep track, because people always wonder, well, how long is it going to take people to travel from town to town? What's the distance? What's the mode of transportation? How far can they move per hour or per day? Maps allow you to figure that stuff out. So maps can help you in many ways as a world builder and a storyteller. And they of themselves can tell stories. So that is it for this episode. The first part of a series. The next one we'll go over overland maps specifically.
So Worldbuilder task.
Yeah. This is an important thing for me if you're doing a world building project, and this will grow over time, but just take a moment and create a checklist of all of the different maps that you want things of. It could be of buildings. It could be of solar systems. It could be of overland maps. All of the maps that you can think that you need right away, make a list of them, because then later on, when you have some time and you don't know what you can work on next, you have a little checklist of like, let me knock out this map real quick. Let me sketch out what this map's going to look like. Even if I go to put it in software, I just want to have an idea of what this map's going to look like. And those are kind of things you can do when you have like 30 minutes and that's all you end up having time for, and you only have 30 minutes. You can still get something done, get a little closer to completion.
Real world task of the day, I feel, falls very close to being a world builder task, but I'll allow it. Just because maps.
YouTube is in the real world.
I know, but just because you love maps so much, I'll let it fly. Okay. So check out the YouTube videos showing how this different mapping software works. Jeff will have some links for you guys
in the show notes.
Yeah, so there are YouTube videos that basically teach you.
Yep. And, but I'm actually going to create a series based off of these, where I kind of go through all of this stuff, showing you basically just through the software I use, the process I do, and kind of show you examples of why things are a problem if you don't follow the order. And I'll make different kinds of maps, over time. So I'll be doing those. I'm going to start probably pushing out like one a week when this episode drops. And then, when I go do overland, there'll probably be more than one video per map. I'll try and make them a little bit more task-based. Let's do this. Let's put mountains onto the map. Let's talk about it in general. So it'll be a fun exercise, especially if you're looking for ways to do it better.
And is this campaign cartographer?
Yes, campaign cartographer is what I use generally to make maps. Sometimes I use a piece of software called GIMP. But that's for highly stylized, non-realistic maps. That's like my dwarven map of the universe, which shows the underground, was done that way because it doesn't need to make sense, scale-wise, because that wasn't at all one of the things they were thinking about when they made it.
Sweet. So go check it out, guys.
Awesome. See you next time. Thank you so much for listening to the Worldbuilder's Anvil.
We would love it if you would share the Worldbuilder's Anvil with 2 of your friends.
And so would they.
If they are unfamiliar with podcasts, then you get to introduce them to the wonderful world of podcasting.
Take them to Stitcher or iTunes, or best of all, just send them to our website, www.gardul.com.
That's GARDUL.com.
Now strike while the mithril's hot.